He stepped into the conservatory classroom wearing a beige t-shirt and a worn gray cardigan, holding a violin case with hands still marked by glue and varnish. The room, filled with elite music students and a stern professor, fell silent, not out of respect, but disbelief. "Who let him in?" muttered a voice from the back. "Must be lost," another whispered, followed by a ripple of snickers. The man didn't respond. He walked slowly to an empty chair in the corner, head down, eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. But before he could sit, Professor Volker's voice boomed across the room. "You there? Yes, you. That seat is for observers with musical background. What are you? A janitor? A tuner?" A few students chuckled, hiding behind their hands. The man paused. "I was invited." "Oh, really?" Volker sneered, folding his arms. "Then let's test your credentials. Play something. Show us what your background is worth." Gasps echoed through the room. No one had ever been spoken to like that in class, especially not by Volker, whose icy critiques were feared across campus. The man hesitated, his fingers brushing the edges of the case. For a second, he looked like he might decline, but then he stepped forward. He opened the case and pulled out a modest-looking violin. No embellishments, no shine, just raw, aged wood. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the bow, and then he played. The first note sliced through the air like a whisper cutting glass. It wasn't loud, but it stopped every breath in the room. The melody that followed was unlike anything the students had ever heard. Gentle yet haunting, complex yet deeply human. The notes told a story of loss, love, quiet resilience. Eyes widened. One girl placed a hand over her mouth. Another student lowered his phone, forgetting to record. Even Professor Volker, arms crossed, began to shift uncomfortably. As the last note lingered, a heavy silence hung in the air. No applause, no sound. Just stunned faces frozen in time. What no one knew, yet, was that this wasn't just a performance. The man who had just played wasn't an amateur, and tomorrow, everything they thought they knew about him would shatter. His name was Daniel Collins. To most, he looked like just another quiet man with calloused hands and tired eyes. But behind that soft-spoken demeanor was a life crafted with purpose, shaped by both tragedy and compassion. Years ago, long before stepping into that conservatory, Daniel had built something extraordinary, the Collins Foundation for Musical Hope. It began in a cramped garage with just a few broken instruments and a belief that music could save lives. Daniel wasn't wealthy. He didn't come from a family of artists or patrons. In fact, he had once dreamed of being a professional violinist himself. But that dream ended abruptly during a pivotal audition, an event where he was humiliated, belittled, and ultimately dismissed by the very man who would one day force him to play again. "Professor Adrian Volker, your hands are better suited for wood than strings," Volker had sneered. "Stick to what you're good at." That wound never healed completely. But instead of bitterness, Daniel found a different path. He taught himself lutherie, mastering the ancient art of violin making. His instruments, though modest in appearance, had a soul. They resonated, they told stories. And through his foundation, Daniel began repairing violins and cellos donated by others. He restored them with care, then gifted them to children who could never afford them. Some of those children years later would play in orchestras, win scholarships, and teach music themselves, each of them carrying a piece of Daniel's legacy. In their hands, there was one story in particular that captured hearts, a boy named Leo, who had lost both parents in a fire and stopped speaking for nearly a year. Social workers said he had shut down emotionally, until Daniel handed him a small scarred violin. It wasn't fancy, it didn't even look new, but it made Leo feel seen. Within weeks, Leo began playing, then smiling, then talking. That same violin now sat in the corner of Leo's bedroom in Vienna, where he practiced daily as a scholarship student at a prestigious music academy. Daniel never told that story out loud. He never took credit. But that violin was one of many lives his hands had helped mend. He lived modestly, in a quiet apartment above a dusty repair shop. He still rode the same old bicycle he'd used for over a decade. And he still believed, fiercely, that greatness had nothing to do with spotlights or applause. It was about presence. And on that day in the conservatory, he was more present than anyone had ever been. What set Daniel apart wasn't just his talent, it was his way of seeing people. He had a gift for noticing what others missed. The nervous fingers of a child gripping a violin for the first time, the way someone flinched when a string snapped, or the quiet pride in a student who finally played a scale correctly. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the weight of someone who had felt deeply, fallen hard, and chosen kindness anyway. Daniel's days were simple. He'd rise before the sun, drink plain black coffee, and spend hours in his shop sanding, gluing, tuning. He never rushed. Each violin he touched felt personal, as if he were helping a soul find its voice. But his nights, that was when he wrote music. Dozens of handwritten pages scattered across a worn oak desk. He never published them. Most didn't even have titles, just soft melodies, aching harmonies, and pieces of a life translated into sound. His wife, Eliza, was the only one who truly knew the depth of his compositions. She had fallen in love with his silence first, then his story. Eliza Moreau, one of the most respected conductors in Europe, had met Daniel at a charity event where he'd volunteered to tune violins for a youth orchestra. She was intrigued by his focus, his calm energy. They spoke for hours that night, not about music, but about meaning, loss, second chances. What began as conversation turned into a love neither of them expected. They married quietly, far from cameras and headlines. Eliza respected Daniel's wish to live away from the spotlight. While she traveled the world conducting symphonies and building educational programs, he continued restoring instruments, often sending them anonymously to places she visited, small schools, refugee camps, community centers. No one ever connected the dots until that day, until that note, until that moment in the conservatory when Daniel played a melody so raw, so human. It pierced through every layer of pretense in the room, and as the final vibration faded into stillness, something shifted. Not just in the students, but in Volker himself. He didn't speak, he didn't move, but his eyes, once cold and commanding, reflected something he hadn't felt in decades. Doubt. Daniel closed his case gently, as if the performance hadn't just redefined how they saw him, but reminded them all of what music is meant to be. Truth. No applause came, just reverence. What they didn't yet know was that this moment would unravel secrets buried for years and bring justice, not through anger, but through undeniable grace. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours of the impromptu performance, a student's secretly recorded clip was posted online. It wasn't meant to go viral. It was just a snapshot, a quiet moment captured without permission. But the internet had its own plans. People didn't just watch, they felt. Thousands of comments flooded in. Who is he? I've never heard anything like this. That last note gave me chills. By the next morning, music forums, news outlets, and even conservatory alumni groups were buzzing. The mysterious man with the modest cardigan had become a sensation. But fame wasn't what shook the conservatory to its core. It was what came next. A former student of Professor Volker, now a music historian and researcher, recognized the man instantly. "That's Daniel Collins," he wrote on a public thread. "Volker humiliated him years ago. I was there." Screenshots surfaced from an old conservatory archive, a list of rejected applicants, with Daniel's name circled and marked, "Lacks presence." The timestamp, 15 years ago. The audition panel, headed by Volker. Then came the final blow, a video from a forgotten workshop, a grainy clip showing a younger Daniel nervously playing, only to be cut off mid-note by a sharp voice. "Stop. You're wasting our time." The voice? Volker's. It was undeniable. The man who had just stunned a room into silence had once been silenced by the very institution now celebrating him. The revelation rippled through the halls of the conservatory. Students whispered in corners, faculty exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Volker, once untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. At first he denied it. "I assess on merit," he said. That man had no skill back then, but no one believed him. The contrast was too sharp, the truth too raw. What hurt the most wasn't just the rejection. It was that Daniel had carried it quietly, never once seeking revenge or validation. He simply walked a different road, one paved not with accolades, but with integrity. And now, without even trying, he had returned full circle, more powerful in silence than Volker had ever been in command. In a special assembly held the next day, the conservatory director took the stage. "We owe Mr. Collins an apology," she said, her voice shaking. "Not for what happened yesterday, but for what happened 15 years ago." Daniel, seated at the back, didn't stand. He didn't wave. He just smiled gently as if forgiveness was something he had already given. But the story wasn't over yet. There was one final thread to unravel, one detail the world didn't yet know, and when it came to light, it would leave even Volker speechless. That night, Daniel sat alone in his workshop. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood, resin, and quiet memories. A violin lay on his bench, half-polished, strings missing. He wasn't working. He wasn't writing. He was just still. Outside, the world was praising him. Inside, he was questioning everything. Had it really been worth it? All those years of kindness, of silence, of letting go. All those times he smiled and said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. All those nights he stayed up gluing cracks in broken instruments, while others climbed stages built on ego. He ran his fingers along the edge of the violin and closed his eyes. "Maybe I was wrong," he whispered to no one. It was the thought he had buried the deepest, the fear that maybe, just maybe, being good didn't make a difference. That humility was invisible. That integrity was just a quiet road that no one walked with you. He remembered Volker's voice from all those years ago. Sharp, dismissive, final. "You'll never belong here." And now they wanted him to give speeches, to teach, to be the face of a campaign about second chances. Daniel didn't want revenge. He never had. But in that moment of silence, a different kind of fatigue set in. Not from the past, but from carrying its weight alone for so long. That's when Eliza entered the room. She didn't speak right away. She just sat beside him, hands in her lap, eyes on the same unfinished violin. After a long pause, she said softly, "Do you know why your music stopped that room yesterday?" Daniel turned to her. "Because it wasn't just notes," she continued. "It was every moment you chose to stay. Kind when you could have turned bitter. It was all the pain you turned into compassion. They didn't hear a performance, Daniel. They heard you." Tears welled in his eyes, not from sadness, but from being seen, truly seen. Eliza smiled, kissed his hand, and left him with a single phrase before walking away. "Keep being who you are. That's the most radical thing you can do." The next morning, Daniel returned to the conservatory, not as a symbol, not as a teacher, not even as a hero, but as himself. No apologies, no speeches, just a quiet man with a violin, and a story that still had one last note to play. By the end of the week, the conservatory had changed, subtly at first, like how students who once rushed past Daniel in the halls now paused to say hello, or how a timid freshman approached him clutching a broken bow, asking if he might take a look. He didn't hesitate. He always said yes. Soon there were whispers of him offering quiet lessons in the practice rooms, of students sitting on the floor just to watch him tune an old cello, mesmerized by the care in his hands. But what truly shifted was deeper than behavior. It was culture. Professor Volker, once feared for his perfectionism, began canceling classes without explanation. His confidence had been shaken. For the first time in decades, his authority was no longer absolute. At a faculty meeting, the director addressed the elephant in the room. Education is more than critique. It's about legacy, and Mr. Collins has reminded us of what truly lasts. Then came the invitation. Daniel was asked to lead a new program, The Soul of Sound, a mentorship initiative pairing elite music students with underserved youth, using restored instruments from his foundation. The goal? To teach not just music, but empathy through creation. He was reluctant at first, but Eliza reminded him, "You were never meant to teach music. You were meant to teach people." So he accepted. Quietly, humbly, the program started small. 3 students, 1 rehearsal room, a handful of second-hand violins, and a dusty piano. But something magical happened. The elite students, polished and disciplined, began learning from the kids they were supposed to help. They discovered rhythm in spontaneity, emotion in imperfection, humanity in sound. Daniel watched from the doorway most days, hands behind his back, smiling. And as weeks passed, the press faded. The viral video was replaced by the next trending moment, but inside the conservatory, the ripple remained. Not everyone approved, of course. Some faculty scoffed, calling it unorthodox or distracting. But others, many others, began to change the way they taught. Volker too returned to class, humbled, quieter. He didn't apologize publicly, but his lectures softened. His gaze lingered longer. He even, once, stopped to listen at Daniel's workshop door. For the first time, the conservatory wasn't just about technique. It was about truth. And at the heart of it all stood Daniel, not seeking recognition, not rewriting the past, but planting something that would outlast both. Roots of respect. The auditorium was full. Students, faculty, and alumni had gathered for the end-of-semester recital, a tradition usually reserved for the conservatory's most gifted performers. This year, there was a buzz in the air, an energy different from years past, because this time Daniel Collins had been invited to speak, not perform, not teach, but to tell his story. He stood backstage, uncomfortable under the lights, adjusting the collar of his cardigan. Eliza gave his hand a gentle squeeze before he walked out. The applause was immediate, but subdued. It wasn't the kind of roar reserved for celebrity. It was reverent, cautious, almost grateful. Daniel stepped up to the podium and paused. He didn't pull out notes. He didn't clear his throat. He just looked around, then said, "I've never been comfortable speaking in rooms like this. Not because I don't belong here, but because for a long time, I believed I didn't." He told them about his first audition, the rejection, the years in silence, the workshop, the children, the choice to keep building even when no one watched. He didn't mention Volker by name. He didn't have to. Volker sat near the front, hands folded, jaw tight, but his eyes never left Daniel. "I'm not here to tell you how to play better," Daniel continued. "I'm here to remind you why you started playing in the first place. If you lose that, none of this matters." There were no standing ovations, no fireworks, just quiet tears, just changed minds. Afterward, Volker approached him, slowly, alone. The two men stood face to face for the first time since that day, years ago, when one crushed the dream of the other. With a single sentence, Volker opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Daniel just offered his hand. Volker shook it. That was enough. Later, a student approached Daniel with a small, hand-bound journal. "We started writing down the things we feel when we play," she said. "You taught us that matters too." Daniel flipped through the pages. It wasn't theory or notes. It was fear, joy, grief, hope, music, in its truest form. He looked out at the campus one last time before heading home, back to his quiet shop, to unfinished violins and dusty cases. He didn't need the stage. He never did, because the real performance had already happened, and the audience would never be the same. In the end, Daniel's story wasn't about music. It was about perception, about how easily we mistake humility for insignificance, about how quick we are to label others, to dismiss what we don't understand, to elevate volume over value. He never raised his voice. He never demanded attention. Yet, his presence transformed an entire institution. Not through rebellion, through resonance. Daniel reminded us that kindness isn't weakness, that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry, and that real greatness often walks softly, wearing worn shoes, behind a modest smile. He didn't seek revenge. He chose to rebuild what had once been broken, not just violins, but people, systems, and stories that had been silenced for too long. In a world obsessed with applause, he taught us the power of silence. In a room full of virtuosos, he became unforgettable, not for how he played, but for why he played. And now, we're left with a choice: to keep judging by appearances, or to start listening with our hearts, to see the Daniels in our lives, to ask, who have we overlooked, who are we silencing, and what truths have we yet to hear? Because sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that changes everything.